And I think for me, and certainly being a mom to teenage girls is exhausting in many ways. But for me, I have really always tried to surround myself. And like this Monday, for example, a girl I started mentoring 8 years ago who now works in the industry, but I met her through UGA. She's 28. I was just at her wedding. And for my children, to see success as a 28-year-old is really awesome. There's another girl that I mentor now who's 23 and just got into the industry too. And she actually happened to go to the high school where my kids are, et cetera. How I surround even my children with that hustle culture of the generation, multiple generations below me, I'm almost 50, is good for me.
Welcome to 99 Humans. My name is Jeff Lakusta, curious coach and Wall Street Journal best-selling author, striving to understand how little things generate big impact.
And I'm Nadia, Carta, tech executive and lifestyle coach with a mission to transform lives and corporations by kindling hearts to generate a zeal for life.
Each week, we investigate stories about the human side of leadership to re-energize your spirit and help you become a stronger leader.
Because the reality is that leadership is messy, goofy, challenging, but always human.
Thanks for spending time with us today. Let's dive in.
You have such an incredible background. I mean, so in doing my own prep for getting ready to talk to you, I mean, currently you're a CRO, Chief Revenue Officer at a IBM company, the weather company, which is an incredible role. But you've also been a VP of Verizon. You have had an illustrious track record across that 25 years, like you say. And frankly, like, that's amazing and intimidating. And when we think about human leadership, it's exactly resumes like yours that make it hard to remember there's a human on the other side. Because it looks like on paper, you've had almost this flawless up into the right career. And you're doing it, you're living your best life, you got money and you got family and like all this is amazing, but that's not the reality. Being a leader myself, I know that it's messier than that.
Yeah.
So that's really what I'd love to hear from you, is a time where that messiness really came to the forefront and complicated the beautiful resume afterwards.
Well, it's funny you say that because I actually started in 1999, when everything was exploding, right, with the internet. And I'll never forget the Sunday before I started on a Monday was Easter. And I'm sitting there having Easter dinner with my grandfather, Pop, who was as grumpy as a grandfather. Now I feel like grandfathers are like happy and lovey. And I was like, I had a really like grumpy chairman of a bank grandfather.
This is very visual. I have a great
No,
visual.
he's very stern. And we're sitting there and I'm all excited. I'm about to go work at Yahoo. And he's like, you're going to go work for that Cinderella internet thing. And I was like, I don't know, Pop. I think it's going to be pretty big. This is the same grandfather that when he would write me a letter, he would type it on a typewriter, right? Love, comma, Pop, right? So he was definitely not eager to get into the internet side of things, but that Cinderella internet thing has become my career, right? And I'll get into the messy story in a second, but I am fortunate enough. I was asked recently to be on the board of the journalism school at the University of Georgia, which is where I went. And interestingly enough, advertising sits under the journalism school where marketing sits under the business school, which doesn't really make sense because they're kind of synonymous in our industry. And I've done a lot with the business school, but consciously decided to get involved with the journalism school. And I was talking to a class the other day, and, it's interesting because when you talk about the messiness, part of any career, any track in life is going to be messy. And if anything, it concerns me how rigorous these kids are, right? Like they all have 5,000 connections on LinkedIn and have done 8 million different, just different internships and things like that. And I'm like, have you partied? That's what I did, Um, and to your point, they looked at my resume and they were like, how did you get into this? And I'm like, let me tell you how much thought process there was. I thought I wanted to be a lawyer. I moved to DC. I worked for a congressman and I was like, I hate this. Right. And I think a lot of kids these days feel like I have to have this track and I have to stay on this track and I have to accomplish these things to do this. And that wasn't the case. The whole reason I got into this industry, Jeff, is because I had no idea what to do with my life. And I went to Ronstadt. I'm like, do people still use Ronstadt and temp agencies? And I got placed as a secretary at an advertising agency.
Wow.
And that's how my whole career started. I was like, this is kind of fun and cool. And it's because I went through a temp agency and got placed as a secretary. So
What's the
that's pretty.
version of that today? Because it's interesting you say that. I think I was one of those kids growing up. I wanted to be a doctor. I picked my college because of its medical acceptance rate. And obviously that didn't play out. Like I eventually along that track said, this is not for me. These people are not my people. I want to do something else. And then went on a path to fail at a million things before finding something. But it does feel harder, and I don't know if that's a cultural or a technology or what's going on, but it does feel harder for folks to do that nowadays.
It really is. And I have a 16-year-old, right? So she's a sophomore and she's going to be starting that college process. And I was telling her the other day, I'm sorry, it's the way it is now. It
Hmm.
seems like, I mean, Georgia, God, I love this school. I'm going to the game tomorrow, but it was a big party school and anyone could get into. Now it's like in the top 10 of public schools, like you got to have like a 34, 35 on the ACT or like a 1500 on the SAT. And I'm like, this is a big state school. Like, why is it so hard? But I can't change that. But to my daughter, I'm sitting there telling her, I'm sorry it's this way, but it is. I can't change it for everybody. And your question about the technology and things like that, uh, I find technology a complete blessing and a curse, right? Um, in that first secretary job, because the internet was like kind of at its infancy, it had one of those little compartments of like while you were out, who called, and you put the little slip and it had like everybody's name. And I answered the phone and I like took messages, and it was like while you were out, you get your little pink slip that told you who called you. Now it's this culture of immediacy that is, I think, completely draining to society, right? Like if my children text me and I don't respond in a millisecond, they think there's something wrong, right? But I've created that. That's my problem is I'm uber responsive. And so if I go like 5 minutes, I'm like, I'm presenting in a meeting, right? Like you got to give me a second. I can't
Yeah.
always respond. And quite frankly, it makes me really sad because it's this voyeuristic culture of like everyone has to see everything and everybody doesn't need to see everything. And I think that's honestly what's caused a lot of like this high rate of like depression and angst with all these kids because it's like, oh, well, look what they're doing, you know?
Yeah. Well, I know a little bit about your story, and actually, it's interesting just the analogy that you're making there of everybody needs to see everything, because that's something that I think is a real point of tension for leaders on, well, what does your team need to see? And everybody gets to make a choice, and there's all this talk about authentic leadership and you being transparent, and all that is fantastic, but also there's choices to be made on, well, what is authentic me at work versus authentic me with my friends versus authentic me with my children or whatever that is. And those choices, I think, are becoming much more difficult because of the same technology trend and everything else. But how do you navigate that?
Well, it's interesting for me. I will say I would give some of my success in my career is because what you see is what you get in my personal and professional life.
Mm.
There's no different version of me, right? Like I pretty much am who I am. And I think that's also why I've done well because like back in the day when I was at AOL, Tim Armstrong knew that he could call me and I would give a real opinion and tell him what's up because to that high level of a person, sometimes people want to sugarcoat and tell them what they want to hear. And I am always radically upfront and honest. Even when I started as the CRO of weather. Um, there was an interview that was done, and I pretty much put it out there. I was like, "Look, here's the deal. I know y'all are going to look me up. I'm actually really not on social media, so you won't find much, but you will find that I am. Um, if I'm completely honest, I'm a mother to two teenage girls. I was like, my husband died of cancer. 6 months after my husband died of cancer, I had a preventative double mastectomy because I had the breast cancer gene, right? Like, I was very closed about it at work for a very, very long time. And then I became a cauldron of anxiety because I had so much on me. And then I became really open about it. So when you think about the messiness of work, I'll kind of parlay into how this actually happened with me. So my husband was diagnosed. What happened is I was very closed off with it for work for a long time because even though I aspire to be authentic, what I could not have happen is every meeting, the first 10 minutes, be like, let's talk about chemo and surgeries and like how Joel's doing. I could not have that, right? I needed work to almost be a safe space. But then it became to the point where I really needed to let everybody know what was going on because I just was having to be completely unavailable for at certain times. So for me, it was really messy because I wanted work as a safe haven and I didn't want to talk about it all the time. But then by being somewhat secretive and not people not understanding where I was when I wasn't in the office, I decided to be really honest, right? And I continue to be really honest on that. I mean, this was 4 years ago. Um, I'm now dating an amazing person who happens to be a widow as well, but I'm very honest with it because there's that whole saying in leadership, you have to see it to be it, right? Which pertains to leadership, but I think it also pertains to like personal crises, right? Like my grandfather Pop used to always say, everybody has their own bag of rocks, meaning it's not a doomsday, but at some point, something's going to go wrong in your life, right? Like no one's immune to it. And it's how you see people handle it and how you see people continue to move forward, right? So I became very open because I was 38 when Joel was diagnosed, right? That was really young. I was at the height of like going up that ladder in my career. I was, my children were 4 and 6. And so it was really messy trying to figure out how to navigate it. But then I became really open because I needed people to see that, like, I'm going to be okay, right? Like, the pastor at my church who I love, who Lauren, who we were just talking about, loves too. She always said, Julie, you're going to have another chapter. And when you are in those darkest days, to even think that there will be another chapter is almost impossible. But I'm living it now, right?
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
and there's happiness.
So that desire for separation is something that I think makes total sense to me. And I have heard from folks who've gone through catastrophic, personal things it can be an escape almost. And then you mentioned that transition to the open and honesty. And I'm wondering if was that a transition from separation to honesty? Or was work still able to be a bit of a haven, a different part of your brain? Because I think that my hypothesis is that that's a little bit of a farce, that the minute you
Right.
start telling people, work then suddenly becomes just, more of the personal story.
I kind of had to respectfully ask people. There's an amazing thing called Caring Bridge, which because I'm not a social media person and I have a lot of unbelievable friends, I was really good about keeping this Caring Bridge page updated on what was going on because so many people wanted to know. And I was very open. I'm like, anybody can look at this thing to hear what like the 87 rounds of chemo and 9 surgeries and what's going on. But I very respectfully said, look, I'm going to be really honest and I'll talk about it at the water cooler, whatever. But please do not ask me at every meeting I walk into, what is the update? because I am here to work and I respectfully ask you to let me have that separation. So
Mm.
even though I was very honest about it, because I kind of needed to be, because I felt like I was almost living a double life, right? And that's taxing, right? That is very taxing, and that is not who I wanted to be. So I became very open, but I respectfully asked for separation.
I think that is a really strength, like just a moment of strength. Talking to you for just this long, the strength that you have is so obvious. But to be able to look at your team and say, "This is what I need from you," is an incredible thing, and I think it's a tip to take away. Are there things that your team did throughout this that really did make you feel supported? Did you make you feel like you had the safety that you needed, that maybe for those listening who may find themselves in a situation, they could make sure they show up in a certain way?
Yeah, I think I would make it almost more broad in how people show up in times of need, right? Like, I will say we are in an industry that I feel incredibly fortunate. The people we work with also are many of our closest personal friends. Like, it's hilarious. Yesterday, my boss from like 20 years ago at Yahoo, Mitch Spolin, who's the best guy ever, was hanging a blind in my house, right? Like,
Amazing.
which is hilarious, but that's like, I mean, he Mitch is a fascinating guy because he was an architect by trade, but then got into our industry. And I mean, I love my house, but I live in a 1938 house that there's problems and things I
Who
can't
else are you gonna
afford.
call for blind
Yeah.
hanging? Yeah.
So, and Mitch was like my old boss, who's still one of my best friends, is hanging a blind in my house for me yesterday, right? It's pretty funny how that works, and I do think that that is the power of our industry. But what I would say is when people, myself included, um, don't ask, just do, right? So I had a lot of my team members who knew the ages of my kids, who I am a very inclusive leader, meaning like I always have people over to my house. I always have team get-togethers. And so I don't like having the mystery. I like people knowing my children, knowing my family. And there were like a couple girls on my team one time who were like, "Hey, we're just going to take the girls for mani pedis," right? It's not what can I do to help. It's how can I help the girls, right? How can I show up? Another good friend um, was like, "Hey, I'm going to the Georgia game. Let me pick up the girls and take them," right? And I think in general, when you say, "What can I do to help?" that's putting the onus on me. I can't put one more thing in my brain. Like, we're not vegetarians, we're not vegans, we pretty much eat everything. And if you show up with food at my house, it'll get eaten,
We're gonna
right?
eat it. Yep.
You offer to take my kids, I'm going to let you do that. But at the same time, I am it is really important when people are in a life crisis, don't make them think one more thing. Like, just do. Like, that's really, and there were a lot of people at work that were very good to me, whether it be helping with my children or just putting a bowl of cut fruit, or even like I had a friend one time who just put flowers and magazines, because I actually still love magazines, believe it or not. I think because my whole world is digital, it's like I like
Something tactile and give the eyes a break.
that
Yeah.
I like that lean back. And there's the person sick, but it is extremely exhausting being a caregiver. And so also that reality of like, I needed a break too,
Mm.
right? So there's the person that's sick, but then there's the person that, like, it is a massive drain taking care of someone who's on chemo. It's physically draining because you're doing so much for them. It's emotionally draining because you're having to watch this horror in front of you. And I needed to sometimes get out of my life, right? And even with my closest girlfriends, I would say, please don't talk to me about what's going on with chemo and surgeries. Like, can we talk about the Kardashians or something,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Like, anything but what is presently going on.
I mean, and you're describing the exhaustion of being a caregiver, but of course you have a job that's incredibly demanding. You have 2 kids that are,
Yep.
just life without that would be exhausting. You're in the messy middle in and of itself, which is
Yeah.
a crazy period.
Yeah.
So, how do you think this experience has shaped how you lead today, in terms of any changes or things that you've decided to keep consistent?
I think for me, I've always been pretty authentic, right? My sisters gave me a sweatshirt back in the day when like hashtag stuff was popular. It said hashtag no filter. Now obviously I'm born and raised Southerner, I have social graces, etc. But I think really, even as I think about the next iteration of my career and how do I get to know a new team, etc., I really take time to invest in people and understand what makes them tick before I really get into work stuff, right? Like I've always been a big fan of, I call them walk and talks, right? We're in the office a couple days a week, and it's like I don't need coffee. Well, maybe I do need a cocktail, but not at noon. Or
At
maybe I
least
will,
do the
but
walk and talk at 4 or something,
yeah.
yeah.
So, but I've gotten in the habit over the years, even when I've been up in New York a ton for work and stuff, is doing these walk and talks, right? Where it's like I get to know the people before I dive into work. And I
Mm,
think that's really important as a leader. You have to know what makes people tick personally to understand really how to work with them professionally, right?
yeah. I think that's a super, super valuable point and something that I've learned from leaders who've done that really well and leaders who haven't done that as well. And the impact of feeling like I'm doing good work, but they have no idea who I am. It doesn't leave you with a good feeling. It also makes it, I think, a lot harder to be connected to the work that fits with what you're good at and all of that. So,
Yeah, and it's also interesting too because I think because I've been so open, I can't tell you how many times people in the industry have reached out to me because they know someone who's going through someone similar, and how can I help them and how can I give advice based on what I went through.
is that not exhausting?
Uh, it is, Jeff. I will say we don't even know each other that well, but I have a lot of energy. Like
This is
I
a skill of yours. Yeah.
this is a super skill of mine of a friend of mine who's single with no children. She was over at my house the other day and she said, "Watching your existence exhausts me." I was
I feel
like,
it's a
"Wow."
compliment.
I was like, but I get my energy from others,
Yeah.
right? Like there's different people that are introverted and they need time to reset. I love to read and I read a ton, and that's like my morning me time. But in general, I get my energy from others. So I love constantly being around people.
Did you always know that, or have you kind of found what works for you and in refueling your tank?
Um, well, kind of a funny story. My mom likes to make fun of this because I'm so uberly social now, and my mom, thinks my life exhausts her. But
That's
this
the
is,
phrase maybe that you carry around with you.
yeah. I was like, I don't. I I remember when I was going to camp in like awkward middle school, and I told my mother, "You never taught me how to make friends." And now, like the grocery clerk at Publix, I'm like, "Do you want to come over for dinner?" You know. um, so I was a more shy as a kid, but that that train left the station by high school.
I love that. I think it's funny you use the word extrovert and introvert, and I was just reading a book actually that talks about labels that serve you or don't serve you, and I think sometimes that introverted label is really just an excuse almost. There's, I don't want to do this. I don't want to go for the promotion because I don't have the conversation. I'm too introverted, or I don't have
Yeah.
the energy to go to the party and I don't have any friends. Like, gosh, if that's a label that isn't serving, it's just not worth. And it sounds like you've got incredibly healthy, fun, energizing labels for how you think about your own personality and what works for you, which is awesome.
Well, and I think for me, and certainly, being a mom to teenage girls is exhausting in many ways. But for me, I have really always tried to surround myself. And like this Monday, for example, a girl I started mentoring 8 years ago who now works in the industry. But I met her through UGA. She's 28. I was just at her wedding. And for my children to see success as a 28-year-old is really awesome. Or like there's another girl that I mentor now who's 23 and just got into the industry too. And she actually happened to go to the high school where my kids are, et cetera. How I surround even my children with kind of that hustle culture of the generation, multiple generations below me, I'm almost 50, is good for me. And
Yeah.
I really feel like one of my mentors who was never officially considered my mentor is Tammy Irwin. She's amazing. She was my client a million years ago as the CMO of Verizon. And we ultimately ended up becoming really good friends. I was just at her house out in Colorado this summer. But she taught me we are all responsible for the next generation of leadership, right? And so for me, many of the girls that I mentor, I take that very seriously, but it's all a giving circle, right? Like they are essentially mentoring my children, right? Because my children think I'm really uninteresting and annoying. But
That's the
that's
standard child response, I think, right? We all think that about our parents.
annoying, a nag, name all the things. So for me to have cute 20-year-old girls over to the house for dinner and they can see what success looks like from that kind of young hustler generation, that's advantageous to me. I help them, they help me with my kids. It's like all part of that next generational leadership because they're leadership to my children, right? And I think that's something as leaders we should all take very, very full responsibility for is like, how are we helping the next generation?
So you mentioned being very careful about who you surround yourself, and one of the secret sauces for your career has been telling it like it is, no matter how high up the chain it is.
Yep.
And that's something that, right, is so unique because that doesn't happen to leaders. And as you continue to progress in your career, how are you fighting that constant push towards people not telling you like it is? Is that something that happens naturally, or do you have particular strategies for knowing what's real and what's not real around kind of the almost glass bubble that sometimes leaders can get in?
Well, I am a big fan of like 360s, right? And from people that are not necessarily in your direct organization because it helps you be self-aware, right? So I had a 360 done once, and not everybody I work with is as extroverted and social as stuff as me. And I got written on a 360 and it really kind of hurt that I overwhelmed people. And I was like, what?
No.
I was just sitting there. I was stunned. I was like, I try to be so friendly and
Sure.
I think everybody wants to be best friends with me. But it's not the case. Not everybody wants to be best friends with me, and it doesn't help that I'm like 6 feet tall too, so I think my presence is overwhelming to people, but that was a moment of like, holy moly. Okay. If I'm in with all sales and marketing people, they tend to be very extroverted. But sometimes when I'm interacting with like engineers and stuff like that, I have to bring myself down a level. Like my uncle, who I loved more than anything, was a very quiet, introspective person. And it's almost like I had to put on an Uncle Doug lens of like, okay, come down. Let's be a little bit more quiet. Don't use jazz hands and talk all over the place because that overwhelms people. So it is very important as leaders that we ask for that kind of feedback. And I always say my skin is like Teflon. I really just want to be better. And in order to be better, I have to hear honest advice. And we all need that. And so I think that's a big thing that all leaders need to do and listen wholeheartedly.
How do you balance that with staying your authentic self that we talked about earlier? Because I think that's I could see some people going, well, I won't do that because that's not who I am. And sometimes that rigidness is something that holds them back versus others who are willing to camouflage into anything. And that really doesn't work either.
Well, I don't think I I think all of our jobs, you have to be true to yourself, but you have to be a little bit of a chameleon, right? You have to, is that the name of that?
The lizard that changes.
Yes,
Yes.
I got that right. It
You
is.
nailed it.
I think it's more about being aware of your surroundings, right? And who you're with, right? So I know that when I'm with a group of people that are in sales and marketing, they tend to be really big personalities. I also know, and that, advice was actually from someone that runs an engineering portion of the organization, that I'm going to stay true to myself, but have to kind of dial it back a little because that overwhelms them, right? That's so I don't think it's being inauthentic. I think it's being aware and being a chameleon based on who you're with.
Yeah. Well, Julie, it's been honestly such a pleasure. I feel very fortunate to get to spend time with you, and knowing next time we connect, maybe we can do it over a cocktail,
Oh,
actually.
yeah, I can't wait. I'm gonna Lauren is gonna be so floored that we we're sitting here having this
It's
conversation
hilarious, and y'all are about to get together.
with her.
Um, as you think about this discussion and reflect on any advice that you have for maybe people who are going through a hard time, and wondering about that tension of what to keep separate, how to keep the bastion of work as their space, and also create the ability to be honest, to have the space to recharge, and focus on what's most important. What advice do you have for folks?
I think it's sort of what we just talked about, Jeff, in regards to I think transparency is really important, but boundary setting, right? Like when I wasn't upfront about what was going on with work, I felt like I was a split personality, and that's just not the way I've ever operated. But once I became honest with it, it was about setting the boundaries of like, hey, I want y'all to understand what's going on. You're welcome to take a look at this kind of website where I keep everything updated. If we're at water coolers or cocktails, maybe we can talk about that, but please do not ask me about it at the beginning of every meeting that has 25 people in it. Cause all these big organizations, all of our meetings have 87 people.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I can tell you are a firecracker just from the 30 minutes of being together. I've learned a lot from you, and honestly, your team is lucky to have you because
Oh,
authentic leaders who are out there being themselves, going through life and showing what it takes to be strong through that and drive results, drive impact, get things done. It's a rare, incredible mix. So it's really, really good to meet you.
oh, awesome. I love it. And next time it will be in person over cocktails, lunch, or something.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's make it happen.